Live from Gusteau's, this is Derailed Trains of Thought. Well, welcome everyone. We're in a very shiny kitchen.
Wow, this feels fancy. Did we dress up enough for this, Nick?
No. I don't know if I have the palate for this place.
Do you have the budget? That's my next question.
Also not. But in the kitchen, we can just steal it without... Well, I guess you shouldn't steal. That's probably not...
No, we're not rats,
I
Nick.
know. Yeah, you're right.
How dare you? Especially since we have a guest with us today.
Yes.
Feels funny calling her a guest. But first, let's mention, what is this podcast, Nick?
This is Derailed Trains of Thought, your premier podcast on storytelling for the creator and the consumer. I am one of your hosts, Nick Hayden.
And I am the other host, Timothy Deal. And with me is my lovely, beautiful wife, Janelle.
Hello, everyone.
You've heard her before if you're a faithful listener of the Weekly Hijack. She was around for our Lost episodes, and you might have heard her instant reactions on Let's Finally Watch This.
Yes, and this is her first time on a podcast trip, like transporting. How was it?
That's right. What do you think of it so far, the casting process? When we get cast somewhere. No.
It's a strange feeling. I hope all of my atoms are intact and like my body is entirely put together. I have to believe that I am because clearly all of my olfactory mechanism is working. I can smell so many wonderful things.
Yes, it does smell lovely in here for sure. It's a very classy restaurant. Did you look out the window there? It looks like we might be in Paris even.
Oh, I'll take it.
We can't always identify where we wind up, so this is nice.
This is nice, yeah.
You lucked out. This is one of the nicer places we've been to on
Much nicer.
Thank you, podcast. It was very nice of you to come to Paris when I was the guest.
I think Natasha will be jealous.
Yes. She'd rather go to Ireland, but...
Well, okay.
Anyways, I guess with that, we'll just go on into our story school. So today we are discussing. Well, should we have our guest introduce this idea? This is actually
we might as well. Yeah,
thought process.
We thought it was due time. Janelle's been a fan of the podcast since even before we were married. Not that she knew about the podcast until we met. I mean, it would be nice if we met through the podcast. But yes, I thought it was high time that she was on, and so I asked her, "What would you like to talk about?" And she decided she wanted to talk about
food in stories.
Because, Janelle, I think it's safe to say you are a foodie, correct?
I think I qualify as a foodie. I think there are people I know that are foodies to a more hardcore extent than I am. Like, they make their own yogurt and they make their own cheese. I'm not at that level yet. And there are compromises I'm willing to make on occasions for certain purposes. But food is like my number 2 passion after music. So... that and my memory are the 2 things that qualify me to talk about food and stories on this podcast.
Yes, she did a lot of preparation for this, more than I did, and more than we normally do.
Don't reveal our secrets, Tim.
Well, yeah, depending on the topic. But Janelle has assembled a collection of categories of how food gets used in stories.
Which I thought was actually fascinating. Like when I heard we were going to do this topic, I'm like, that's a really good idea. It was not on my radar at all. And I think we have a lot we can chew on.
Yeah,
I
could tell you were looking for the right verbiage there. It's like unpack or unwrap, taste,
exactly,
sample. Okay, anyway.
Right. So should I just
jump
on in?
Give us your first category. Or I don't know how you have it split up here.
Sure. Yeah. Well, originally I had 3 big categories with 3 subcategories, and then I was counting my examples, and I thought could probably just be 7 categories, just straight on their own. So yeah, the first category that I was able to come up with was stories in which food is the subject matter.
Okay, like give us a good example. What's a good example of that?
Well, this lovely kitchen that we're in is one of them. Food as subject matter. I mean, like food occupies a central place in what the story discusses.
Because in Ratatouille, the whole idea that food is a art form is kind of major to the whole process. And then the fact that the climax basically solved through a good dish is interesting.
Through a good meal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it certainly was for me, and I wouldn't be surprised it's a family movie that it may have been your first introduction to, okay, well, how can food be an art? What does gourmet food actually mean? Because for kids, I mean, I was this way. Food was an obligation as opposed to something I looked forward to.
It's like, my son, it's just like, lunch takes so much time. I could be doing stuff. So that's sort of a thing. And Ratatouille was such a fascinating movie, too, because, like, I saw the preview, I'm like, food and like kitchens and rats, and why is this is not going to be any good at all. And then it was a fabulous movie.
Oh, well, that's good to know.
Are there some other examples you have of that type?
Yes. I will say that this food as subject matter is the smallest category I could think of for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. Like, you could probably make a lot of movies where food is the central point, but there's just so much to talk about in a story.
I mean, I guess it is very specialized. I mean, I don't want to get ahead of it. Like some of your other examples I see in your list is Julie and Julia, which is about a cook. So if your main character is a chef of some sort, then that's very specific.
I never have really thought of like movies that food's the main topic, but it's weird that we won't have more of them because it's a major part of everyone's life and we do it multiple times a day. And hopefully it's not just this, when we were kids, it was just like this transactional meal, so hopefully it's meant from God to be something to enjoy. And so, yeah, it's interesting that we don't actually have a little more about it sometimes. So we're a little more, at least in America, a little more action-oriented.
Yeah, I think we'll get to this in another of my categories. Food as an important plot point makes a little more sense in that respect.
Yeah.
But I think food in stories is kind of like music in stories. It's everywhere, and it's, in one sense, it's an essential part of the package.
Yeah.
But you're not going to focus on it unless the main character is a cook or the main character is a musician.
That's true. Runs a restaurant or, some sort of food job.
Yes. Another one on the food as the subject matter is The 100-Foot Journey. This is a movie about some Indian immigrants that have to emigrate to France.
Okay.
And they open up an Indian restaurant, and there's people of different cultures encountering each other.
Conflict.
Yeah. Between the French people that meet these Indian immigrants and some of their cultures show in their styles of cooking. There's a lady that runs a French restaurant in the countryside that's got 1 Michelin star, and she's going for the 2nd Michelin star. Big deal. And she butts heads with the father of this Indian family. There's a scene where he's railing at her because this French chef is teaching his Indian son about French classical cooking.
Okay.
And he says, when you've got something good, you don't sprinkle it in, you spoon it in.
So food is representative of the clash of cultures almost.
Yeah, in a big way.
And I guess that's probably true with a lot of these movies where food's the main subject matter, is that food also stands in symbolically for something else. It's an expression of the cook's character, about the theme of creativity or something else so everyone identifies with it, not just the cook.
Yeah, that's true. In Julie and Julia, Julie's exploration of food she's also exploring Julia Childs' life, and she's exploring herself in a sense.
Okay.
Like, I want to complete something, or I work at this hard insurance company job that sucks the life out of me, and I want to do something that's for me and something that gives life.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the last one that I have on this food is subject matter list is Le Chocolat. Which, Nick, you just reminded me of.
Well, my wife reminded me of it, but yes, I have seen it. That's a European film, isn't it, originally? Or maybe not.
I'm not
maybe
sure.
Maybe it's more indie. But I was curious, I forget, the 100-yard, what is that?
100-Foot Journey?
100-Foot Journey. Is that a European film?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I was just curious. I guess I'm curious just because I wonder if, I get the sense, and this might be wrong, that European film would be more likely to make that a subject matter than Americans. We tend to be a little more like utilitarian sometimes with our food.
Possibly. And I was going to mention that when I got to another category.
Okay, go for it.
About why do we never see our superheroes eat?
Except at the very end of The Avengers. And it's kind of uses for comedic effect.
Which is another of my categories.
Okay, so I feel like we better get on to one of these other categories.
Yes.
Okay, so the next one I thought was most worth addressing was food as a plot point, either an important plot point or a semi-important plot point. And out of those, I have 18 examples.
Wow. Well, this is just a handful of them, and we'll riff off that.
Yeah. First one I could think of most obviously is Oliver Twist.
Okay.
Please, sir, I want some more. And doesn't that get him kicked out of the orphanage or something?
Oh, I've read and seen it, but I actually forget exactly. But yeah, it caused some sort of issue.
I mean, whenever I think of Oliver Twist, that's all I think of.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really know that much of the story beyond what I probably know Oliver and Company more than I actually know the original story.
I mean, I guess in some ways, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with the chocolate bar and the golden ticket, I mean, it's not really about food. It's just the
opportunity.
Yeah.
Would that kind of fit into this category where it's about food is representing something else, like something that they need?
Oh, sure. I mean, something in the story happens because of a chocolate bar.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that counts.
Yeah.
Let's see. Great Expectations is another one. Pip is told by this Magwitch to go get him some food.
That's true.
And then he becomes very terrified. He's like, I just stole, and he's all afraid of getting caught.
And it causes the entire plot to happen.
Yeah, basically, because Magwitch is so thankful that he gave him food and sustained him.
Gives him great expectations.
So when I thought about the food as an important plot point in business, I was thinking partly of food shows up and something happens because of food, but also the absence of food motivates something.
Yeah.
So Oliver Twist
Oliver Twist
is like that too. This character is starving, therefore they do something. Midwife's Apprentice fits into that category. I doubt either of you would know. This is a book I read in middle school, I think. But it follows this street urchin that becomes apprenticed to a midwife. And she basically, I think, gets to do that because she lives on the street and she's starving. And she just knocks on the door of the midwife's house and asks for something to eat.
Okay.
And the midwife is this stern, hard lady, but for some reason she takes her in. And then the whole rest of the book happens.
Okay.
Driven by hunger, sort of.
Which is a really good motivator. I mean, in some ways, that's the start of Les Mis, is that he stole a loaf of bread to get to jail the first time, and then the second time, I think he steals that just so he can get a job. So it's not so much food-oriented the second time, but he was arrested the first time for stealing bread for his family.
Yeah, it's a common plot. Like, everyone can identify with this.
It's a basic need.
It's a basic need. Yeah. You know, sometimes you just have to be one step ahead of the hitman.
Yep.
Oh, one of my greatest movies. Yes. Fabulous.
So I'll just touch on a few more that I guess are a bit either relevant or unique. In Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, I think, there's that scene where Frodo and Sam and Gollum are climbing up a mountain, and Gollum is trying to do what he wants, and he takes out all the rest of the food and tosses it down the mountain, and he's doing that to frame Sam.
Which I seem to remember as a pet peeve of yours.
Well, yeah. Well, pet peeves of, anything they change was a pet peeve of mine, but that's neither here nor there.
Oh.
Lord of the Rings has several food-oriented scenes. I don't know if you have them in some other categories as well, probably. So, yes. Oh, I got a ridiculous example.
Okay.
Ready? Yeah. Tim, you'll appreciate this. The Wild Wild World of Catwoman. There's a soup that makes you dance.
Wow.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. For all our Mystery Science Theater fans.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to just throw it in there because it's technically a plot point.
Yes.
In a plotless movie.
In a very ridiculous. I mean, it's the most memorable scene in that movie.
It is. That's absolutely true. All right. Go ahead.
So this one just seems unique to me. The movie Lion is just called Lion. Because the main character's name is Sheru, which in his language means lion.
Okay.
It's a story of an Indian boy that has the traumatic experience of getting onto a train that isn't taking passengers, and the train takes him like 3 days away from his homeland, and he's 5 or 6 and can't read.
Oh.
And so then he gets adopted by an Australian family, and on and on and on. He grows up, and he forgets he was ever from India. And then one day, he's at a party, and his Indian friends bring this Indian dish of these certain kinds of pastries, and they're decorated a certain way. And suddenly, he remembers, I was from India. And it was all that long ago. And that starts his whole journey of trying to remember where he was from and find his mother.
That's interesting. I mean, because food does have that sort of attachment to memory, and that's a really good use of that in that movie.
Originally, I was going to bracket this and a few others under incidental detail. There are a lot of, most of the examples I can think of, food is an incidental detail, but it's still doing something.
Okay. Like, give us an example.
when food fleshes out a fantasy world, or the world that's in the story. For example, in Avatar, the Water Tribe people have very distinctive food, and Aang tries it and he hates it and then pretends to like it. But like sea prune soup or something like that.
So it's sort of the cultural expression of fantasy, or I guess even non-fantasy, depending on how foreign it is.
Yes. Other ones, food can embellish or make more real or put more flesh on what is the nature of the fantasy world that you're in. Another good example that I can think of is Hook. Have you guys seen Hook?
Yes.
So remember the scene when the lawyer Panning is eating with the Lost Boys and he can't see any of the food they're eating? And then he finally just like starts playing with them and pretends to fling food off of a spoon and suddenly he can see the food.
It's a pretty great scene. Yeah.
I guess you could say even with lembas bread, we were just talking about Lord of the Rings and food, and the Elvish food, that seems to be at least something that seems very distinctive to Middle Earth. I always think of like, oh, one small bite will satisfy you for a while.
What's interesting in some of Brandon Sanderson's books, like there's a lot of curry. Like it's just like the way the world like has evolved that everyone like eats different types of curry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because it actually makes a lot of sense in some ways. Rice is kind of a basic staple. So
okay.
So it's a different way of the fantasy world evolving, I guess, than our European style.
Okay, it's interesting. Well, does his fantasy worlds have an Indian flair? Because Brandon Sanderson's not Indian.
No,
so.
I can't remember. I don't think that's in Stormlight Archive, but I think it's in some of his other books.
Huh. Okay.
I can't remember offhand.
Kind of a scientific idea.
Yeah, but it fleshes out in a unique way that you're like, oh, I would never have thought of that necessarily from my Midwestern upbringing.
Sure.
That is interesting. Let's see, others.
What about this? You have Redwall on your list, because I think of Brian Jacques as an author who really loves, and he's talked about it before, or he did talk about it in interviews, about how like whenever they would read about, and then they had a feast, and he's like, well, I want to know exactly what they had in that feast. So in all of his books, whenever they eat, you know exactly what's on the menu.
Hobbits are back on the menu. No, but I wonder, and I don't know, maybe this is going into another category, but it does seem like in some of these more traditional fantasy things, like Brian Jacques, Tolkien, Lewis, you have eating as almost just a celebratory moment. Mm-hmm. You know, that's just this sort of like, it captures the fantasy world, but also just captures this sort of, I mean, it is in normal life, any sort of celebration you have, or even not celebration, just ceremony you have, usually has some sort of food attached to it. And I think it just adds that sense of fellowship and realism and camaraderie to a lot of these fellowship-oriented fantasies.
That's true. I can think of a lot of times in books where they've just met a character, or they fought to test each other's mettle or something, and then they're best buds, and they have a meal.
Or like even like romantic comedies or just other things, like they'll all sit down to meet the parent, and there's always this awkward conversation afterwards and something blows up. But I mean, it's always around the kitchen table.
It does seem like a very human nature sort of thing to do. Like when we want to get to know someone, we have them over for lunch or
coffee
or something. We're eating or we're consuming something while we're getting to know them. And, Jesus did this as part of his ministry too. And, the Pharisees would complain about he would go eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners and all this kind of stuff.
I mean, the church does this all the time.
Yeah. So it feels very true to life when we see that in the story.
I guess then it's weird, like you say, the superheroes never eat. Apparently, they never have time for like friends at all, to go and like just
they have
talk.
time. They have time to drink at least, depending on their movie.
Thor, especially.
Oh yes, I have to mention one more food fleshing out the fantasy world business, and that is Beauty and the Beast. In that case, the food's dancing in front of you.
It does make it more fantastical when your kitchenware is presenting your food to you.
Then you have to fellowship because they're saying be our guest. So
beef ragout, cheese souffle, pie and pudding en flambe, etc., etc.
Exactly.
So I'll continue on. I've noticed too that sometimes what the incidental food is doing is pointing out a character quirk. One of my favorite examples is in the movie Major Pain that I still need to show my husband because for some odd reason it feels important to my childhood. It's about this over-the-top hard-boiled army guy that goes to teach like a middle school ROTC program.
Okay.
And he meets the school counselor and she's about as opposite him as you can get, very feminine and graceful and nurturing. And he's like, burying the kids in the ground and watering their heads. But anyway, there's a scene where they go out to dinner and they get the food and he just gobbles the whole meal up in 5 seconds and thrusts the fork down and says, "That was a mighty fine dinner. Ain't you gonna eat?" And she says, "My stomach's a little upset."
Aw.
That reminds me, just a similar thing. We were watching there's Mighty Ducks TV show on Disney Plus. We're watching with the kids. In the second season, there's super competitive hockey coach, and then the let's just have fun hockey coach, and they're having baits all the time. And she's like, "Don't you just raid the kitchen for ice cream?" Like, no. And then later on, they catch him doing that, and it's kind of this character moment sort of thing. Like, oh, you've loosened it up a little bit. You're raiding the kitchen for ice cream. So I know that your example reminded me of that sort of, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. In some cases, the food illustrates something that's funny about the character or a way a character is growing or something that's just odd or distinctive about them. Is it Despicable Me that has the minions?
Yes.
And one of them's always saying banana?
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Yeah, just quirky, spoo.
That's a Babylon 5 thing.
Yeah, sorry, I had to throw that in there.
Excellent.
Oh, so as we're mentioning old hijacks, there's a peanut butter scene in Lost, which is not an actual peanut butter, but where Charlie and Claire are pretending to eat peanut butter, and it's a bonding character moment.
Because Claire really misses, they're plane wreck survivors, and she's really missing peanut butter, and there's no peanut butter on this island. So he finds this jars and then just pretends to lick it, and you can kind of
you kind of taste it when he's doing it.
You really do, yeah. It's very effective, and she appreciates it.
Oh, yes. Other distinctive examples. If you all have seen Runaway Bride.
Long time ago.
Okay.
Been a while.
I've not seen that one.
See, Tim, you just haven't seen any of these romance things.
I can't imagine why.
The main character, the bride that keeps running away, at some point gets asked by the reporter that she ends up with how she likes her eggs. And, well, he's investigating from everyone else, and he discovers that the way she liked her eggs was the way whoever guy she was with liked her eggs.
Okay.
Which means that she was just refusing to have a preference in favor of whatever guy because she was just thought she had to meld to whatever the guy wanted.
That's a really interesting, clever way to talk about her character personality. And it's true to life, I think, for some people. Like, what do you want? Oh, whatever you're having.
Wasn't there a illustration you used from J. Michael Straczynski that was about a man and a wife and how she buttered her toast or something?
Or it was the difference between them calling it jam or jelly, and they had a certain way of saying it, and it was a very specific, sort of detail.
Strong feelings about it for some reason.
Very strong detail, And those little details about how someone wants their food or their breakfast is something that shows the person,
Sure.
He only likes it this way. Don't put the mayonnaise on,
Yeah. I like that as a more specific sort of character quirk as opposed to, when you first mentioned this, I was thinking of the stereotypical fat character who just loves to eat all the time, constantly chewing stuff. And done the right way, that could be. I mean, I see you have Winnie the Pooh here on your list because him and Honey, but there's a lot more nuanced ways you can do this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The series Atypical is about an autistic young man, and there's one episode in which he goes to spend the night at a friend's house for the first time, and that's a big deal because he's slightly autistic and can he handle the change of routine?
Yeah.
And one of the things that his mama does to help him is he tells his host he really likes buttered noodles.
Okay.
So that's one of his things, buttered noodles.
Buttered noodles. My kids would dig that. Yeah.
Other big thing that I could see food doing was that it can humanize the characters. Or as we've been talking about how food is such a basic common human need. Sometimes I think of food as sort of grounding these characters into humanness that we can relate to on that basic level. And I kind of had a second title of this as domestic scenes, which I've already got something of a mention. But Swiftly Tilting Planet starts with Thanksgiving dinner.
That's true, because it's a chaotic book, but it's rooted in this family dining room, really, and everywhere else. But there is where it's rooted.
Yeah, it keeps returning to that. Other example, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensey children go to the beavers and the beavers feed them.
Yep, and then they're friends, and that's really the last safe spot they have for quite a while.
So at the top of this list, you had the Boxcar Children. Is that because of when we talked about this, or did you grow up with that series?
I think I read maybe one book or half a book.
Okay. See, I read all the original ones. That was kind of my go-to at the library for, a certain age. And that always stuck out to me because they tend to go on vacations and interesting trips around, but they tend to be usually either by themselves or with their uncle or something. But the kids, I mean, the oldest are probably in their teens, but they always made a point of like showing when they made a meal, which kind of stood out to me as like, oh, they're doing this very grown-up thing of like cooking, because like, and it does feel that kind of domestic setting of, and you get interested in like, okay, what are they going to do? How are they fending for themselves?
I mean, in some ways, this is maybe this doesn't quite connect, but I had thought of it earlier. But like in Two Towers, there's a scene where Sam and Frodo and Gollum cook that rabbit stew. I mean, I think the whole chapter is called that, isn't it, or something like that?
Probably.
Stew, but even Gollum has a sense of, that's probably the place where the three of them seem to connect the best. It seemed like in my memory.
Well, I mean, it's been a while. In the movie, there's a bit of discussion where Gollum wants to eat raw fish, and Sam wants to eat like potatoes and potatoes.
Yeah. But then they have that. It's a domestic scene in the middle of this like trudging
through the wilderness. Yeah.
Yes, I've got lots of things in this category, and here's kind of an anti-example of this similar thing in Devil Wears Prada.
Okay.
Miranda Priestley, she sends Andy to go get her lunch or something like that. And then Andy goes to all this trouble, and where are they, New York City? To get this very specific thing that Miranda Priestley ordered. She does all this work and comes back, and then her boss doesn't even eat it, something like that. And Andy's relationship with food changes through the meal. And then, I just remembered, I don't know where this fits in, but there's the coworker that Andy has that is starving herself to go to Paris, and she talks about her new diet that's very effective. I don't eat, and when I feel like I'm about to faint, I eat a cube of cheese.
Would you put in this category too, those scenes in movies where like the plate gets cold and they have to cover it up and move it out?
Oh, because they're
waiting for someone to come home or something, and they're late. Or the long table.
Yeah.
Where there's like people on both sides.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
I just thought of something from a romantic comedy. You might be proud of me, although I don't know if you know this one. And I don't know if it goes under this category under the character quirks, although I guess it's kind of could be either. But in 2 weeks' notice, the two main characters are like rich millionaire and who is Hugh Grant, and then Sandra Bullock is his secretary or whatever. They spend a lot of time together. So much at some point they're at a restaurant and they're talking about something else, but they're each splitting up what's in their salad, like because he doesn't like certain things that she'll eat, and he doesn't like certain things that she'll eat, and they're doing this just kind of unconsciously because they both know each other's likes and dislikes so well at this point.
I have not seen that movie.
Congratulations, Tim.
Good job. Yeah, I think that'd be a good character moment. Let's see, what else should I mention?
This was kind of neat. Are you thinking of the pineapple scene?
Yeah. The Studio Ghibli film Only Yesterday.
Okay, which I have not seen.
We only saw this...
Yesterday?
Actually, I think it was 2 days ago, but it's close.
How about that? So, story of a single young lady that goes to the countryside and remembers her childhood, basically. Mm-hmm. And one of her memories is of trying a fresh pineapple for the first time.
Okay.
And there are several dinner scenes in Only Yesterday because it's all about her remembering her childhood, and lots of family moments happen at the dinner table. But this pineapple, they're so excited when they see it, and she's jumping up and down with excitement to eat it, and the older sister finally learns how to cut. And they do, and they all sit down around the table to try it. And then we're not sure if it's not ripe or something, but it's gross and it's hard. And
no one likes it.
No one likes it. Okay. Studio Ghibli often uses food. I mean, my daughter was writing a little paragraph for school about Ponyo, and she was showing it to me tonight. But, her eating ham is like this
big deal.
Like, ham.
And I always remember there's even in Castle in the Sky, there's a moment where they're on the run from pirates and the government and all this stuff, but they pause in this cave to have a little meal of like a sandwich with fried egg. Mm-hmm. And I always think that's a strange thing, but I hear other people like doing that kind of combination.
And I had to mention here just because I was asking my kids about, we're going to talk about food and movies, and feels like, well, you have to bring up Castle Cagliostro when he downs like that entire meal and a half real quick to heal himself. It's my son's favorite movie.
Yeah. Apparently, the way to recover from a lot of blood loss is just to eat a lot of food.
It's a ridiculous scene.
It is.
In a ridiculous movie. But sorry, sidetrack.
Sounds like a boy kind of response, actually. So, second to last one is comedy. Food as comedy. Boy, you can make some funny things happen when you use food. In Onward, there's a scene close to the beginning where the younger brother is getting ready for school and he's trying to eat breakfast. And the older brother is bouncing around doing his fantastical role-playing thing. And he makes the younger brother keep dropping his toast. And boy, I felt it. I mean, it was hard for me to watch because I was feeling his disappointment with continuing to drop the toast, but it probably was just funny.
You mentioned before we started Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which no, Janelle hasn't seen, but like it's all about living food and all the really wacky things they do with food as a prop, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's very creative and a lot of comedy there.
I kind of had this as a category I wasn't going to address, but maybe it deserves mention. Maybe it's this category. But when food is your characters. I was thinking like VeggieTales and certain episodes of The Muppet Show.
Yep, well, you're not wrong, yeah.
You can get a lot of puns with food that like, let us join together and all the...
Or they want to get married and then cantaloupe.
Yeah, all that kind of good stuff. Or what's that one song? I never harmed an onion, so why does it make me cry? they're full of food puns in that one.
Yes. Good. I found a way to categorize those things. Anyway, there are a few other funny food comedic moments, but suffice to say, food can be funny. And then I could think of other instances where food shows up in a story, but I didn't have a good category for it, so that's other.
Okay.
And they're just random things, like in the Captain America first movie. Remember when I think it's the general is trying to make a proposal to the main scientist, and he shows up and puts a steak in front of him, and do you want the steak? And the guy or the scientist says, I don't eat meat. So the general proceeds to eat it and says, you don't know how hard it is to get this good kind of a cut up here.
Oh, okay. When you're like, he's interrogating the captured guy. Okay, he's trying to get info. And I guess the idea is like eating to...
entice, get under
his skin or
Yeah,
something?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I always thought of it as like an intimidation factor, but he offered him the food and it's like, okay, well, here, I'm going to eat it.
You know, there's a weird thing, like movies would do that where like there'll be like some sort of hostage situation and there'll always be like a meal. It's like a inverted supper in some ways.
Yeah, well, I guess you could be playing into the whole starvation aspect, like when a certain space station captain gets interrogated and he starts eating a sandwich and there's a question of whether the sandwich is poisoned.
Yeah.
And he hasn't been able to eat anything for a while.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Or another famous show where like you dress the prisoner up and go on a beach and you're just having breakfast for some reason.
Or you let him out of the cell for a little while and give him some breakfast cereal and he starts making this intimidating conversation while he's then asks for milk.
Yeah, exactly.
Clearly you guys get the idea.
Yes.
So one other thing that I will mention that I'm going to limit myself to because I could probably talk for another hour. I'm annoying myself because I can't remember the title, but the author Frederick Buechner wrote a series of books that have as one of the central characters a strange person named Leo Bebb. In the first book, he's setting up the action of the story, and there is a protagonist named Antonio Parr, and he has a girlfriend, and they're getting together to just hang out or to figure out what to do about this person named Leo Bebb that they've heard about. And they order beef stroganoff, and they talk about stuff, and Antonio Parr gets upset and decides to go find Leo Bebb. The story goes on, and chapters later, Antonio is thinking back to beef stroganoff night and all the things that had set everything else in motion. And I thought, now if Frederick Buechner had just said, we ordered dinner, well, okay, there you go. It was just we ordered dinner, but it was beef stroganoff night. All he's got to say is, we ordered beef stroganoff, and you know exactly what scene he's talking about. So that was just an interesting use of a concrete detail to really help your mind attach to the story.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, we hope that you didn't come into this podcast hungry.
No, you might leave it hungry.
Yeah.
My takeaway from all those, which are great, more than I ever thought about food and stories, which is awesome. But my gives like two takeaways as a creator is that food is very good at becoming a useful detail, either for creating a character or a moment or a setting. And it's humanizing. In most of these examples, we said it really draws out the humanity of the people and the culture and whatever. And I think those are two things that it does kind of intuitively that I never really much thought about until we started analyzing it.
Yeah, I concur. It's a flavor, but it does say a lot about humanity's need to eat.
And what it says about us, how we eat and when we eat and what we eat.
Yeah, and the fact that it's not just a utilitarian thing. We like having flavors and textures and smells associated with our food. And when it's a concrete thing that can really help an audience find themselves in the story, is like something they can identify with, like, oh yeah, man, this is making me hungry.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I don't often see a superhero eat. A lot of the examples where food is important, I found, were from stories from like a previous era, where you might have to work harder to get food, generally speaking. Now, I think we don't see our superheroes eat very often, partly because a lot of us are frustrated by our own limits of needing to eat, or we wish we could be superheroes. We wish we could do everything we need to and more without sleeping, without eating, all that stuff. And so we make our superheroes do that. And I mean, on a nicer side, food's not essential. In a lot of these superhero stories, food's not critical to the story that you're telling.
They're just moving from thing to thing, yeah.
I guess one counterexample to that is in Captain America Civil War, that when Vision and Wanda have one of their first connections when Vision's trying to cook Wanda's home, and it's like, I'm not sure I'm using the right ingredient or something or other, which is interesting, of course, because he's an android, so he probably doesn't even need to eat, but he's trying to do this very human thing. I don't know, it's an interesting moment.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
All right. Well, that's a very appetizing story school.
I found it tasty.
Yeah. So next is soundtrack.
3, hit it!
For our first soundtrack, I have it. I've been trying to pick a new unused game constantly, but I had to go back to Super Mario Kart for this one because it fits this topic perfect. This is called Happy Breakfast. And it's a very cheery song about breakfast done to the Super Mario Kart.
For some reason.
For some reason. I don't know. It works, and I like it, but it's weird. It's remixed by Po Soo Yan, who used to be known just as Po in some of the older remixes. And I hope that you enjoy.
Hello, rise and shine. Don't you know the time? They will pass you by. Lots of things to do, strategies to think through, 'cause the race is soon. Start the day out right with some fruit delight, joy with every bite. Mangoes and cherries, grapes and strawberries, yummy so very. So relax, unwind your overthinking mind with a bowl of fun with life. Everything's just fine out in the warm sunshine. Happy breakfast, so enjoy the view, fresh breezy ocean blue, at a table set for two, with our stomachs satisfied, no way we can lose. Happy breakfast to you. So start the day out right with some fruit delight, joy with every bite. Mangoes and cherries, grapes and strawberries, yummy so very. So relax, unwind your overthinking mind with a bowl of fun with light. Everything's just fine out in the warm sunshine. Happy breakfast, so the view, fish breezy ocean blue, and our table set for two. With our stomachs satisfied, no way we can lose. Happy breakfast to you.
And we're back. Hopefully you are just kind of happy and not too hungry now.
Yeah, that was a very pleasant song.
Yes.
I enjoyed that.
Next, we are going to go to, well, we'll start with Once Upon a Sentence.
So last time we had this sentence from, well, I guess we'll read the sentence and then we'll see if who knew what that was from. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. I think we had one person correctly guess that was from...
Me.
And what was the book?
Sorry. A Christmas Carol.
Correct.
Yes. Fezziwig's Party, isn't it?
It is from Fezziwig's Party. So good job, Janelle. So that was from A Christmas Carol, but we're going to kind of change up Once Upon a Sentence now.
We're deleting Once Upon a Sentence and remaking it as Once Upon a Scene. And in this case...
Which I'm going to give the exact same
I
jingle.
know. But I had to rename it. Okay. You got to heavy remix it with lots of bass and wub-wubs.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, anyways. We're going to now take a quick little scene from some sort of visual media, movie, TV show, something like that, play it for you, and that will be your challenge for the month.
See if you can identify what piece of media this comes from.
Which means we, in a whole year, we didn't once get the stranger in there. But
How strange.
I know how strange.
How odd, yeah.
Anyways, so Tim, can you go ahead and play us our first clip?
Okay.
Your mind's not on food. You're thinking about somebody with long eyelashes, and you're smelling that sweet perfume. Hey, whoa, it's boiling over. You're burning the chow.
Okay, there you go. What was that from? You can send your answers to derailedtrains@gmail.com or contact us on Facebook or Twitter or any of those things. You can even leave a comment on our website, but remember, you will be giving away the answer. So think carefully.
Unless you give us a cipher and the key.
Don't make it too complicated, Nick.
All right. And finally, it is January, and we are going to go to our take
On Tales.
why I say it's January, because that's our annual book club book review month.
Yes, we have our No Pressure Book Club.
Which is very no pressure.
Very no pressure, sometimes low participation, at least the ones of us here, even Janelle, she joins us on that. Actually, we take turns reading the books for our No Pressure Book Club.
I think we've all read all of them this year, correct?
I think we did, if I remember right. Well,
I did not read 20th Century Boys.
yeah.
Okay.
We'll get to that. But yes, this was a very eclectic year for the book club.
Yeah, which is kind of fun.
These are all over the place, I feel like.
So what's our first one, Tim? I actually don't have a list of them.
If I remember right, the very first one was The Tempest
By William Shakespeare.
by William Shakespeare, indeed.
All right.
My memory of this one is kind of fuzzy, so I'll let one of you kind of give us a summary what The Tempest is about.
Let's see. Prospero is exiled onto an island, and he's then taken over the island, and he's hungry for revenge. And he has a daughter named Miranda who's never met a man in her life. And this bunch of people from the country that exiled Prospero gets shipwrecked on the island because Prospero has learned how to do magic and has created a storm to shipwreck them on the island, and all sorts of Shakespearean shenanigans ensue.
Shakespearean shenanigans.
It's one of those I had meant to read for a long time because people would mention the Tempest here and there, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know what this is about except there's a Tempest. It's a weird one.
It is. It kind of falls within the fantasy category, I guess, of Shakespeare. But the memory is fuzzy for me because it's one of those that like you would really want to read it and then go watch it, which I never did.
And no, I really need to see a visual version of it because I mean, there's some interesting things. I remember the ending being particularly strange. That just seems like it like wraps up in like Prospero, who's this one revengeary thing, kind of gets it and then he kind of just changes his mind. At least that's my memory of it. Maybe Janelle can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's basically something like that. He like, I don't remember how it is he exacts revenge on the people he's targeting, but he doesn't kill them. I think he like confuses them or makes them feel sorrowful about something.
Yeah, I think there's something kind of like that.
Well, and one of the people, the king that exiled Prospero was one of the ones that is shipwrecked on the same island. And we watched this thing about like some choices that a theatrical troupe made when they were doing, we didn't watch their whole performance. We watched some of their behind the scenes of their making of process. And they point out that like Prospero has this servant on the island that he kind of orders around
in a horrible way. Yeah.
And it's kind of ironic because he's complaining about how the king mistreated him, his servant, and now he has his own servant that he's mistreating. And it's a sort of cycle of oppression, I guess. So maybe something along that is part of what changes Prospero's mind and why he doesn't wind up killing the king and everyone else.
Like some Shakespeare, like all Shakespeare, it works better if you see it, and I didn't. And I think as you see it expressed and you can see the layers, I think it's one that I would appreciate more with more exposure to.
Yeah. This was what we read at the beginning of last year, so it's a whole year removed from it. And yes, I'm not sure our opinions of it were very fleshed out at the time. Did you have anything that you really wanted to say about it, Janelle?
I don't think so. I like Shakespeare generally, and the ending I do remember the Prospero's turnaround seemed kind of abrupt, partly because it takes place off stage, interestingly.
Yeah.
But I like Shakespeare generally, so I had fun reading it.
I did enjoy reading it, but I felt like I was not understanding as much as I could.
An interesting read, but yeah, it's one of those like we were left wanting a little something. Yeah. So the next one after that was 20th Century Boys, which is actually a manga series. So we just had nominated this was one of Greg's. No, this was Nathan's was nominated this. And we just had volume 1. This is by Naomi Urasawa. And so, yeah, again, manga, Japanese graphic novel series. It's by volume 1. I'm not even sure if he was referring to the first Tano Boken, which is, if you know manga, the regular like paperback size. Yeah. I wound up reading this in what's called the Perfect Collection, which has like 2 of those, and it's like a little bigger.
Yeah, I read 4 of the small volumes that equals about what you had, I think.
Yeah, and I read a little bit farther. Like I'm over halfway through the series at this point, and that first volume is really just. It's not really standalone. It's just like an introduction to the series.
It's in a nutshell. It's really about 2 timelines, at least. In about the 1960s, this group of kids growing up and they're having dreams of being superheroes and saving the world. And then also late 90s, they're all 30-something.
Like at the turn of the century, basically. Just like it's 1999, essentially. True, yeah. And they start learning about this conspiracy that is use some of their stories that they wrote when they were kids about like an evil organization trying to take over the world.
And it's actually happening. It's a fascinating setup. The characters are really good. I mean, really well. It's like a very compelling series. I didn't get as far as I got to. I need to finish it, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to know what kind of genre to put it in, because it's got some very light, realistic sci-fi elements. You said it reminded you a lot of Lost, and I can certainly see that with the flashbacks and the different time periods.
And trying to change your perception of certain things. And it's like realism plus, like there's certain mystical things going on.
Yeah. There's always some new conspiracy or mystery ongoing sort of thing. And it's interesting how long he's able to keep this going. Like I said, the first few volumes is really just the setup.
Oh, yeah.
Largely.
Yeah.
And then you have to keep going. And the fact that he is able to continually kind of have these little arcs of like resolving, here's a long-held mystery and here's the resolution of that, and trying to stop this like world from ending scenario.
And it's interesting because underneath all this is this theme of basically like growing up and what happens to your dreams and realism versus the childhood fantasies of things. And it was fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, the art style is the type that tries to combine some aspects of realistic human features with a little bit more abstract. And sometimes when people combine that stuff, I don't think it's very flattering looking. And so it's really not my favorite art style, but it's right on the border of like, it kind of works for me. But yeah, it's definitely the way that it's drawn out. Janelle didn't make it through this. This is not one, you can't really read a manga together.
Not easily. No.
And I kind of felt like the first volume kind of leans a little bit into some of the male humor.
It does.
There's some crudeness. There's even a little bit more fan service. Fan service doesn't last super long, but it's in there in like the first volume. I think maybe to entice readers, to be honest.
Well, early on, I'm like, oh no, it's going to go like this. And it never did then. Like it almost fell off the map after like the first couple issues.
Yeah, first few
But
chapters.
it was annoying.
Yeah. And, shaking her head. She didn't have anything to contribute to that. Because
I would say if you have interest in manga, I think it's certainly worth reading.
Yeah,
it's very good.
I'm looking forward to finishing it for sure. I know a previous guest here on this podcast, Nate Chen, is a big fan of it and has talked about it a fair bit on his YouTube channel. So after that, it was Greg's turn, and he nominated The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane by Robert E. This is by Robert E. Howard, who is the creator of Conan the Barbarian. And this is definitely within the realm of pulp fiction.
Yeah, this has good news and bad news, I think.
So, yes, it is very pulpy. Solomon Kane is this very interesting character, very memorable.
He's a very memorable character.
He is essentially sort of a vigilante Puritan.
That is exactly how you describe him.
He dresses in Puritan garb with the hat and all that kind of stuff. I'm not even sure what time period. I guess it's supposed to be like 1600s, 1700s.
Something. Yeah.
I don't remember, but he carries with him a revolver and a pistol, and he's kind of a holy avenger sort of character.
Yeah, and just goes around killing sometimes supernatural things, sometimes, well, there's usually some sort of supernatural element.
Yeah. So this book is a collection of a lot of his short stories that were short stories / I guess they're mostly stories.
Yeah.
A little slightly longer length. Originally appeared in magazines, maybe serialized.
And I think what I liked about it is that, like, when we read just one story or two stories, it's a very compelling, he's a very interesting character. It's written in this very pulpy, like, just visceral sort of style. So it's fun that way. When you read all of them together, it's a lot. It's too much.
It's so dark.
Yeah, it gets darker. Like they seem to be in the collection chronologically as far as Solomon Kane's life. It seems like, but they're always dark. But they get darker and darker. I feel like, and it's just like like a flavor of it was kind of interesting as you get this character and get this sort of very pulpy. Oh, that's interesting, but as a collection, it was, I think, a little much.
Yeah, I think we only made it about 2/3 of the way through the book. I know we stopped before you said was like one of the darkest stories.
Yeah, there's one where he's almost not. Yeah, it's not human.
Vampire bats or something like that.
Yeah, that one was. Yeah,
but we felt like at a certain point it's like, okay, we kind of get the flavor of this.
Yeah, it doesn't get anything new to it. It just keeps doing the same thing.
And you had told us that as much.
Yeah.
That, and I suppose we should also note that there's several of these adventures that take place in Africa, and yeah, they're definitely, we would consider them racist today.
Yes.
A very not politically correct depiction of that continent and its inhabitants. So, I think in a unique way specific to its time period.
Yes. At the end of my version, they had like some details of Robert E. Howard's life. It's not like he was kind of a depressed at the end. You can just feel this sort of like unsettledness, like the world's horrible and we need to fix it somehow.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of hope about it. And it's kind of oppressive by the end. But on the other, I think as a flavor for pulp and Robert E. Howard, maybe a series or two might be worth reading, but I'm not sure the whole thing unless you really love that sort of pulpy era.
I think I looked at the same book you did, and I think they mentioned he was pen pals with, I'm forgetting his name, but the guy who created the Cthulhu, what is his name?
Lovecraft.
Yes, Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft. I think he was pen pals with them, and that kind of exploring like the dark underside of, in a spiritual way, which is, again, it's an interesting choice. I don't know that people would write this way today, and not just the racist African stuff, but like the idea of this ancient evils that he's constantly encountering.
And just as a kind of a window into that era and that style, it was a good example of it, I think. Of that sort of, that old school fantasy with the dark gods but again, I don't need that much
races.
of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The interesting good thing is that the good side did always win, but it always seemed like it was just barely. Or you have to go down into the mouth of death, and you could see all the evil and all the darkness, but you never really got how much more powerful the light was.
It really is like maybe the predecessor of some of these movies, like, in order to fight the monster, you must become like the monster. It had some of that feel to it.
Yeah, because Solomon Kane talked about being a servant of God and having this feeling of being led on by providence, essentially,
And
to
that was
confront
kind of
these things.
interesting.
So that was interesting, but there was never any conversation about or depiction about who is God, what is the light side counterpoint to all this darkness.
The thing is, I think basically he was the agent of God, and he alone was the only thing standing between all these evils. I mean, it's not particularly theologically accurate, Puritan.
No, no, very true.
But yeah, I think idea's interesting. I think as a collection, it's just too much.
Yeah. All right. Well, following up on that, we went to someone who does portray Christian ideas and fantasy in really interesting ways. It's been a while since we had touched Madeline L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time Quartet, or the Time Quartet, I guess is what it's called. But this book we were on was A Swiftly Tilting Planet.
The third book.
The third book in that series, yes. This was very enjoyable, although, like a lot of L'Engle's writing, fairly confusing. Actually, not as bad as the previous one. I've not as weird as the last book, I would say. The second book in that series.
From my memories of reading originally and my rereading it, it is, I think, easily the best, strongest of the time.
Oh, really? Even more than A Wrinkle in Time?
I like it better than Wrinkle in Time.
Okay,
personally.
How do you summarize this story exactly?
There's a mad warlord who's going to basically like start a nuclear war.
Right.
And through a series of tithing, basically sort of like time traveling into other people, Charles Wallace is supposed to find some way to stop it, but he doesn't really know how.
Yeah, he's not really given a direction, just some vague ideas, understanding of, okay, there's trying to understand who this warlord is in South America, which very strange to have a nuclear warlord in South America. But
in Patagonia? Is that correct? No.
I think it's
Vespuccia?
Vespuccia. Yes.
Yeah. Is that a real country?
No.
I don't think so.
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
More politically correct to have a non-existent country.
Yeah.
Some of the different time travel and stuff is very, very interesting. I could make complaints about she's to use Dr. Who very timey-wimey on connections sometimes, which is second time through was kind of frustrating to me because I'm like, I couldn't quite make the last connections, and maybe I wasn't supposed to, I don't know, because she's kind of okay with that from my understanding. But I think just the ideas and the themes and stuff are just, there's some really neat stuff in it.
What is bizarre to me about her writing style, we were reading concurrently with this for some of it. In our small group, we were reading her book, Walking on Water. And she mentioned how she didn't know how some of these elements were going to pull together. I don't know how you write a book like this without like having pre-planned outline of how all these connections happen. But apparently she did this somewhat organically and kind of through just happenstance of reading or something, found these real life connections between, what were the...
Wales and South America.
Yeah, and it's not like Wales is in the sea, but like Wales is in the country.
Yeah.
These Welsh immigrants or this Welsh mission or something.
It was just interesting that she had to go find a real connection because, like, you're making all these things up anyways. But I do think Wrinkle in Time is still the most accessible. I think Swiftly Tilting Planet is probably the most ambitious.
Yeah, it is a very ambitious story, and it is fascinating. Some of her ideas about kind of letting go and letting God kind of direct your paths, and because like every time Charles Wallace tries to direct where he's going to kithe or time travel or whatever, it turns out disastrously. And
there's just the sort of generational impact of things, which remind me a little bit of, I don't think anyone else read it, but when we did the book club, Descent into Hell, there was this really fascinating, and it's very hard to explain because like that was a very kind of mystical book, kind of like how time periods touch each other, even though they're not actually concurrently happening.
Yeah.
And she would use some of that. And I feel like that was some in Walking Water. She would talk about that a little bit. Just that there's a touching of things even across time. This comes out in this book. Anyways, a lot of fascinating ideas. Charles Wallace is a great character. Kithing is fun. I think if you're super logical, some of it you might push against. But I think it's completely worth reading.
Yeah. Very interesting blend of spirituality and time travel science. No one writes like Madeline L'Engle does.
That's true.
Do you have any other comments, Janelle?
I loved it. I guess I feel less analytically about it, or I feel a little more comfortable just letting it go and letting the connections be intuitive. I enjoyed how she wove together so many different threads from so many different people's stories. And she did make you work a bit to figure out what the connections were, but for some reason I enjoyed that.
I would agree. I mean, the connections are very nice.
Cool. All right. Well, then next book was another from a recurring author, at least recurring on our book club list. We return to the world of Earthsea.
For the third book here, too, as well.
That's right. Another one by Ursula Le Guin. This book was, The Farthest Shore. We originally had the wrong book. We realized, oh, no, wait, that's the fourth book. We need the third one. So The Farthest Shore. Difference from Tombs of Atuan was the last one, which took place in one single location, island in Earthsea, for the most part. This one was back to kind of the more traveling the seas sort of thing, with our main character, Ged, who is now an older man.
And the main plot is really that there's magic is leaving Earthsea, and they're trying to figure out why. So Ged and this young prince basically go on a journey to figure out what's happening. Why is kind of the life draining out of everything? It's kind of a very epic setup in some ways.
Although, again, in unconventional ways, because that's the way Ursula Le Guin writes.
Yes. Yeah, because it's kind of an epic setup, but it's still a very personal story. There's no big epic armies running towards each other. You know, it's just two people kind of wrestling with philosophical issues and finally meeting one other person and wrestling with philosophical issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a sort of setup that I feel like has been used in other mediums. It feels a little like Once Upon a Time-ish in some sense. Like the magic is going out, we're losing the spark.
Or even some of the like never-ending story sort of emptiness sort of things, or the nothingness, depending on which version.
It feels a little bit more... Because, like, it's not just magic. It also, in some ways, it's not quite reason. Because, like, all the people that this affects, they're not, like, descending into madness necessarily. But there's definitely a
it's the will
loss
to
of,
live. The vivaciousness of life is kind of falling away. Like
everything's becoming grayer.
Yeah. And I think for the Earthsea books, I think this one has the most, is in some ways the most abstract thematically. Like I think it's interesting, and she's saying a very interesting and mostly true thing. But I think it's harder to put it. You almost need the book to kind of encapsulate it. It's hard to put into words easily. I think what she's exactly saying or trying to say.
Yeah, it would be hard to really do a dissect of that, especially without talking in detail about the ending. I feel like
I know some of the thrust of it was people were trying to escape death, and the balance of the way the world had to operate was that death had to exist. And to that end, the eerie scene with going into the land of death and closing the river of death, basically.
Yeah. Ursula Guin's writing style, she's a very good writer, very memorable images. I think we said that every time we've done a book of hers. And even though she comes from a non-Christian worldview for us, like she still says a lot of true things, I feel like. Like she's very perceptive.
Yes, definitely there's plenty you could chew on.
So what do you think? We've had 3 Earthsea books. If someone were, which one do you think is the most accessible?
I would still say A Wizard of Earthsea.
I would agree with that.
It has the most traditional, like, young man goes into a bigger world trying to seek out for himself. I mean, and it turns some of those ideas on its head for sure. I mean, Ged makes some pretty big mistakes, and then his whole worldview is challenged over the course of that story. But the format of it is still fairly, I think, accessible. But this, I definitely enjoyed. I've enjoyed every single one of the Earthsea books we've read.
And we'll probably get
Dahanu,
Dahanu one eventually,
Yep, I think so. All right, well then finally, to close out the year, we went to one of your favorite authors, Nick.
Yes. We went to The Gambler, which is just a short story, novella, I guess, that I've bn wanting to read just because it's Dostoevsky.
Fyodor Dostoevsky?
Yeah, and I read
the author you named your child after?
Yes. But I had not read it. I've read all his major novels, or his major post-conversion novels. He has a couple pre-Gulag novels.
Did he wind up in a Gulag?
Or he was in prison for a while for trying to being part of an anarchist group, I believe.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Gambler was after that, too. But I've seen it around, like, Gambler sounds interesting. I know that Dostoevsky had trouble with gambling addiction at some point. Gamble Away Wise Wedding Ring at some point.
I feel I should mention that this book, The Gambler, has actually nothing to do with Kenny Rogers. So don't look for country music in this one.
And again, it's been a long time since I've read I really need to read one of his major novels again. So I was talking before the podcast that I don't always remember scenes real well after a number of years. So I don't know how well I can compare it to the old stuff. But this is basically about Russians outside of Russia. And I read somewhere that this is kind of his only kind of Russians abroad story. That was kind of his idea.
Okay.
Which gives you that sort of Victorian air different than some of his other novels.
I can kind of see that. I mean, it takes place in France? Or where
I don't remember now.
I'm trying to think
Germany?
where Roulettenberg. Oh, maybe it is Germany, Roulettenberg, because he goes to France later. But it does kind of have that exotic feel of like, okay, it's not a spy novel, but you know how like
We're
James,
abroad and
we're
there's
abroad. Yeah, it's not like James Bond, the espionage stuff, but it's like that feeling of being in a foreign place.
So we're in this gambling town, basically.
Called Roulettenberg, which
Yes.
I didn't even think about till toward the end. It's like, oh, roulette is literally in the name of this town.
And then this Russian family that's hard up for money for reasons you don't know at the beginning. There's this French guy and this British guy and some other characters. It starts with this very and the main characters, Alexei, is this tutor for this Russian family. And you spend the first half of this novella basically trying to figure out what is the relationship between all these people.
Yeah, it really just kind of throws you into the beginning of it, which you've said is kind of similar to some of his other books, which
And I
I
don't know-
guess is his thing.
Just this thing, like you just slowly unwind, like, oh, like your 100 pages. I remember the first book I ever read of his, Brother Karamazov, and like it took me like 100 pages to figure out what in the world is going on.
Well, and in this one, it takes like 4 chapters or so before you actually even find out what the narrator's name is.
Yeah.
or what's his relation to all these
So
people.
it takes a little bit of patience, but simultaneously that setup creates this drama because you're like, it's a mystery. You're unwrapping this. Why do they need money and what are they here for? And why is the uncle or the grandfather so mad? Or the uncle, I guess. What is it? It's the general.
The general.
The
Yeah.
general. And all kinds of stuff happens. And there's a weird love story in the middle of it. But also then there's some very interesting kind of tragic scenes about gambling, about people who just kind of go and kind of have fun, then they win, they get kind of this buzz, and then they lose just everything they own.
Yeah, it really does. You could tell this is written by someone who understands the psychology of gambling, how it messes with your head and the addicting qualities of it.
And I think there's also some elements from his other book that idea that there's a lot of very conflicted characters who want to do something but can't, or can't do something and wish they could. Very Roman 7 sort of, like what I want to do, I wish I couldn't. You know, like the love story feels that way. And even Alexei himself, where he like runs off with this girl who's just going to use up all his money, and he knows she's going to use up all his money, but he can't stop because pride, or there's a lot of, and that's very normal. There's these relationships that on one hand seem very strange, but I think it's how people actually act.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly literary in the sense you could make your own interpretations, and we did afterwards kind of talk about, okay, why did he do this? Was it because of this or that, or yeah?
But there's just a lot of internal angst and confusion inside a lot of the characters. They all do. They like do something, and the next day they'll do something completely the opposite.
It feels a little bit of like the rich classes are crazy, or there's some saying like that. All these rich people who are really obsessed with maintaining money in some way are just kind of nuts. Nick and I have been going full blown into weekly hijack spewing mode. Did you have something you want to jump in here, Janelle?
It felt like a soap opera to me. And it felt also a little bit like a Jane Austen novel. And I say that because all of the action happens by people talking.
Mm-hmm.
I just found that interesting how upper class and contained it was in that way.
And I think that's like dialogue is drama is a lot of Dostoevsky. There's just a lot of just.
Yeah, it is funny. It did feel like kind of a drama of manners or of high society stuff without like, there is a romance, but it's not really a romantic book.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jane Austen without the romance element, I think is accurate.
Yeah.
What a thought.
That, and it had a initially hilarious grandmother character.
I mean, if you would film this, that scene would be like perfect. I think they did try to do some movie inspired by it at some point, but I don't know if it's any good or not. We'll do a modern version.
Yeah, but I mean, even she takes a tragic character arc in some way because
there's this fine line, Dostoevsky, between comedy and tragedy. I think sometimes like people can be both. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other thing I thought was interesting about the book was that it's titled The Gambler. And about halfway through I was going, who is the gambler? By the end, I think it's clear it's the narrator, Alexis Ivanovich, but it seems like everybody at some point wants to gamble or thinks about gambling. The grandmother gambles. Yep. The general is accused of gambling. Polina gives Alexis money to go gamble with, etc.
And I think they're gambling just thematically as well a lot with, how are we going to get out of this? And we're risking things in order to lose it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yep.
So, interesting book to round out this very
interesting collection of books.
It's all over the place. I mean, we did have a couple with the fantasy, the books in the middle that were kind of written for younger readers. That's kind of in our wheelhouse. But we had manga, we had Shakespeare, we had Dostoevsky, we were all over the place. Yeah, dark pulpy, all over the place this year. Well, we're probably running long, Nick, but real quick, did you have any other books that you read this year you want to talk about?
I will try, just because we just got done with it. My version of Gambler came also with The Double, which is another one of his famous novellas.
Okay.
And I'll just say, I'm glad I didn't pick that one because that one's way tougher to read. It's one of those that, it's kind of a slog to read. It's about this minor government official who he finds someone it's basically him, but running around and it kind of starts stealing all his friends and his job and everything. But the dialogue it's hard to explain even the point of it. I mean, it's almost talking about the way social society at that point, and I think still nowadays, wants to cram you into a certain spot, except if you don't fit there, then you're just really awkward. And so this character is really awkward. He rambles, and his language is really stilted and weird, and it's I hear it in the Russian, it's just as bad or worse. But then this good version of him who's very suave and can play all the social games starts stealing all his social capital in some ways. Falling in love with a girl that he kind of loves but can't even, he's just a disaster as far as socially. So it's almost that it's a real representation of that you want to split yourself between what you're supposed to be to fit into society and who you actually are. Anyways, hard read. I don't know if I can recommend it unless you really love that sort of thing.
Okay.
But I was glad to have read it.
Sure.
So I'll just throw that in there since it's kind of in the same wheelhouse as The Gambler. I guess Dostoevsky thought it was one of his most important ideas. He always wanted to redo it, take the idea, but write it better. I guess he didn't like the book itself, but he thought it was a very important concept, whatever he was going for.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, my big read of 2022 was the first of the Wheel of Time books.
Yes.
A series that Nick has talked about for years and years, for as long as I've known him.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The first one was The Eye of the World. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, you read it, Tim. Yes, The Eye of the World.
Yes. Well, so Nick has talked about Wheel of Time series for, like I said, all this time. It was a little disappointing. I'm sorry to say. Now, I will say it is every time I would sit down to read it, it was very readable. The pages would just flow really quickly. I really liked his writing style. I never felt like
he does have a very good writing style.
Yeah. For what I had gotten the impression was that he could be very detailed about certain things. And maybe he gets even more.
He does get a little more bogged down in some stuff.
More bogged down in later books. But I've certainly read other books. I'm thinking of Aragon that I got way more bogged down in details than I did in this one.
He's not particularly technical, but he can be very detailed.
Yeah. The downside of it was, I guess this is more of a pet peeve of mine. When I want to go into a fantasy book, I want to enjoy the adventure of it.
Yeah.
At least to a certain extent. But some writers I've noticed feel like if a little conflict is good, then a lot is really engaging. And I felt like in a lot of this book, there was a long haul where I was like, none of these characters like each other. Everyone's distrustful of, and it's not that they don't have good motivations, but even the characters who knew each other seemed like they were constantly irritable or picking fights. And not that that's not a bad thing. I mean, the hobbits get annoyed with each other from time to time, but you start from this certain level of respect. And I think it was meant to be kind of humorous, but even in the beginning, it seemed like everyone was kind of dysfunctional with each other.
It's interesting. I read one time Brandon Sanderson talking about Robert Jordan because he grew up reading Wheel of Time, then became a crazy fantasy writer himself.
Uh-huh.
And saying, he pointed out some scene in the second book where it's and there's 5 layers of conflict going on at the same time, and he thought how amazing he could do it all at the same time. So it seems like that's one of those things that either you
connect with or you don't.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a problem. And I was, to be honest, a bit disappointed in the climax, because you would think after reading 600 pages of this book, you'd be really set up for what the climax would be. And yet I was still confused throughout most of it. It's like, what is going on? And you realize later what had happened. And I was like, if I had understood what was happening, I would have enjoyed this final confrontation a whole lot more.
Yeah.
So those are some of my complaints about it. I'm intrigued enough. Like, there's definitely some plot hooks I could tell. Like, this is stuff for a future book that, like, I would like to see. Like, the main character's accidental visit and meeting with like the prince and princess and queen of the realm was highly entertaining. I would love to see more of those characters and be curious to see the direction a lot of these other characters go on, because it's definitely you feel at the end it is a conclusion. But all these characters' journeys have really just started.
Yeah.
So
it's a beginning, but not the beginning.
Yes.
As the beginning of the book goes.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah, I have very mixed feelings. I'm sorry, Nick, to trash one of your favorite books.
No, that's books. Fine. It's interesting because I remember back in high school when we were reading it, one of my friends, the book 4, it's like a book of 4 or 5, one of them, which takes like 100 pages to get out of where they are. And then later on, it's like sometimes it'll be 100 pages till like Randall Thor will show up in a book. And so there's definitely is this divide between people who are okay with that. Like, hey, I'm just on for adventure of everything. And people are like, but the stuff I want to hear, you're delaying too long. So I think you've just hit on some of those things that tend to separate some of the, especially as it goes on, people who like, I have another friend, he loves Eye of the World, and that's the only one he cares about.
Really? Yeah. That's bizarre. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll see if I wind up doing another one. It took me like 10 months to read that thing. I would like to do other stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll see.
I'll throw in real quick, like 5 seconds. I also read and mentioned The Death of Ivan Ilovich. Just read it, guys, by Leo Tolstoy.
Oh, that's right.
We mentioned, but it's super short. I read it like while we were driving to our vacation spot this summer.
Because you would read a depressing Russian novel on vacation.
Well, I read that novel on vacation. I also read Heir to the Jedi, like the Star Wars thing.
Okay.
So I balanced it out.
Okay, there you go. That's
Ivan was better.
That's acceptable. Did you have any books from 2022 that you want to talk on real quick, Janelle?
Yes, I read a tiny book, I think aimed at, well, I'm not sure what grade, either middle school or earlier, called Missing May by Cynthia Rylant. I think it received a Newbery Award or something.
Okay.
Small little book. I read it in an evening, probably while you guys were recording a podcast episode. And it's this short, powerful punch of a little book. It's a story of recovering from grief, basically.
Okay.
This young girl that got adopted by her aunt and uncle. They live out in this trailer in West Virginia, and the aunt dies. And there's this weird boy from school that knows where you could go do a seance, and she and the uncle go to try to do this, and they get disappointed. The person's not there, and they basically just journey back. And it's the story of the uncle figuring out how to move on, and the girl figuring out how to cry over her aunt's death. And Ms. Rylant uses images and style and character moments to tell all this in a way that felt easy to connect with and relatable and powerful and communicated a lot of emotion with the short means. So enjoyable read. I thought it was effective, if sad, bittersweet.
Well, what's it called again?
Missing May.
Missing May. I have to remember that. I'm sure there's a couple students that would enjoy that.
Nice. Well, Nick, I think this will go long, which is not uncommon for our book club episodes. But
we actually went through those pretty quick, all things considered.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So, everyone, that is the end of our take on Tales. I'm not sure we'll leave here very quickly.
Yeah, we haven't actually eaten yet.
I know.
We got to eat something.
You got to eat something, yeah. We're going to go do that pretty soon, but let's tell them how they can get a hold of us or our podcasts.
Okay. Well, our website is derailedtrainsofthought.com. All of the episodes of this podcast, Derailed Trains of Thought, as well as our other two podcasts, The Weekly Hijack and Let's Finally Watch This, where we talk about TV and movies, respectively, in very different formats.
Yeah.
So you go check those out at derailedtrainsofthought.com.
You can always email us at derailedtrains@gmail.com for any sort of questions or comments, or you want to guess our quote or our scene. Other than that, I think we'll be on our way, try to order something, hopefully.
Yeah.
podcast providers with some.
All our
money.
episodes are also available, I should mention, on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and Spotify and wherever fine podcasts are found. But I should set up my soundtrack real quick
Yes.
before we go. I've got a remix from Kirby Superstar, because Kirby loves to eat.
Yes.
And this remix is called Food Frenzy, which feels very appropriate. It's funny. I don't usually listen to heavy metal, but if you give me a good video game melody that I enjoy, I might just head thrash along with it if you put it in a metal garb. That's what this is. This is the remixer is Game Metal. I think Game Metal has got a YouTube channel, but this is from OC Remix. And yeah, it's Food Frenzy. I hope you enjoy it. And if you don't, well, it's at the end of the episode, so you can just skip it.
Yes. All right. I guess with that, we're out of here. This has been Nick.
And this is Tim.
And your guest, Janelle.
Thanks for listening, folks.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
It's au revoir.
I don't know.
Au revoir.
There we go. Oh, there we go. Better.
Thank you.